Uṣool Al-Ḥadeeth, The Methodology of Hadith Evaluation, by Dr. Abu Ameenah Bilal Phillips. 8. Literature. The origins of the Hadith literature can be traced back to the letters, laws, and treaties that were dictated to scribes by the Prophet ﷺ himself. They are likewise to be traced back to numerous sahifas, documents, which were compiled by the companions and successors, and to some of which reference was made earlier. The discovery of the sahifas of Hammam ibn Munabbih, which has been published by Dr. Muhammad Hamidullah, reveals the nature and character of these sahifas. It proves that they were more than just simple memoranda, but were complete records of certain of the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, presented in the form familiar to us from the later collections of Hadith. The early sources of Hadith fall into three distinct groups. Firstly, there were the books of Maghazi, almost synonymous with Sirah, such as those of Ibn Ishaq and others, in which most of the Hadiths of a historical nature are to be found. Secondly, there were books on fiqh, such as the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Maalik and the Kitab of Imam al-Shafi'i, which contains a large number of legal hadiths cited in the context of legal discussions and mingled with rulings and practices of the companions and their students. Finally, there are works that are strictly collections of hadith as such. It is these latter that will mostly be dealt with in this chapter. The Muwaṭṭa of Maalik. Malik ibn Anas ibn Amir was born in Medina in the year 717 CE. His grandfather, Amir, was among the major Sahaba of Medina. Malik studied hadith under Az-Zuhri, who was the greatest hadith scholar of his time, as well as under the great hadith narrator, Nafi, the freed slave of the Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Umar. Malik's only journeys outside of Medina were for Hajj, and thus he largely limited himself to the knowledge available in Medina. He was severely beaten in the year 764 CE by the order of the Amir of Medina, because he made a legal ruling that forced divorce was invalid. This ruling opposed the Abbasid rulers' practice of adding in the oath of allegiance given to them by the masses the clause that whoever broke the oath was automatically divorced. Imam Malik continued to teach hadith in Medina over a period of 40 years, and he managed to compile a book containing hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ and rulings of the Sahaba and their successors, which he named Al-Muwaṭṭa, the beaten path. He began his compilation of hadiths at the request of the Abbasid Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, 754 to 755 CE, who wanted a comprehensive code of law based on the Prophet ﷺ's Sunnah, which could be applied uniformly throughout his realm. But, on its completion, Malik refused to have it forced on the people, pointing out that the Sahaba had scattered throughout the Islamic empire and had taken with them other parts of the Sunnah, which also had to be considered in any laws imposed throughout the state. Caliph Harun al-Rashid, 768 to 809 CE, also made the same request of the Imam, but he was also turned down. Imam Malik died in the city of his birth, in the year 801 CE, at the venerable age of 83. Imam Malik's method of teaching was based on the narration of hadiths and the discussion of their meanings in the context of problems of that day. He would either narrate to his students hadiths and the statements of the Sahaba on various topics of Islamic law, then discuss their implications, or he would inquire about problems which had arisen in the areas from whence his students came, then narrate appropriate hadiths or athars which could be used to solve them. After Malik completed Al-Muwaṭṭa, he used to narrate it to his students as the sum total of his madhab, but would add or subtract from it slightly whenever new information reached him. Consequently, there were more than 80 versions of his compilation. 15 of them are most famous, and now only one version, that of Yahya ibn Yahya, is available in its original form, complete and printed. The most famous commentaries are by Ibn Abdil Bir, who compiled two commentaries, At-Tamheed and Al-Istithkar. Muhammad Zakaria al-Kandalawi wrote Awjaz al-Masalik Sharh Muwaṭṭa Imam Malik, which was published in India and Egypt. The MUSNADS. Of all the various types of large hadith collections, the MUSNADS appear to be the earliest in origin. Yet, many of those which are generally ascribed to certain of the early authorities on hadith were in fact compiled by later traditionists. They collected hadiths which were related to them by or on the authority of a single important narrator. Such are the MUSNADs of Abu Hanifa, al-Shafi'i, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, and others, none of whom is in reality known to have compiled a Musnad work. The Musnad, which is generally known as that of Abu Hanifa, was compiled by Abdul Mu'ayyad Muhammad ibn Mahmud al-Khwarizmi, d. 1257. The Musnad of Ash-Shafi'i was compiled on the basis of his Kitab and al-Mabsut by Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Asam, d. 860. The work known as the Musnad of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was compiled by al-Baqandi, d. 895. The Musnad of Abu Dawud at-Tayalisi, which is considered to be the earliest Musnad still extant, was not compiled in its present form by at-Tayalisi himself, but by a traditionist working in Khurasan at a later date. The Musnad of at-Tayalisi. An old, rare, and important manuscript of this work is preserved in the Oriental Public Library of Patna and has been fully described by Maulawi Abdul Hamid in the Catalogue of the Hadith MSS kept at the OP Library at Bankimpore. The Hyderabad edition of the Musnad has been published on the basis of this manuscript. Abu Dawud Sulaiman ibn Dawud ibn al-Jarud at-Tayalisi, to whom the Musnad is generally ascribed, was of Persian origin and was born in the year 750 to 51 CE. He studied traditions with more than 1,000 scholars of his day, among whom many prominent names stand out, including Shu'bah, in whose narrations at-Tayalisi seems to have specialized, Sufyan al-Thawri, and others. He had a sharp, retentive memory and is said to have dictated 40,000 traditions without the help of notes. During his lifetime, he came to be accepted as an outstanding authority on Hadith, and especially on the long Hadiths, so that students flocked to him from all corners of the Islamic world. His teacher, Shu'bah, having heard him discuss certain traditions with his students, confessed that he himself could not do better. Strict traditionists like Ibn Hanbal and Ali ibn al-Madini accepted at-Tayalisi's authority and related traditions from him. Yet he was nonetheless not above criticism from some experts who believed that his memory sometimes failed him. He died in the year 813 at the age of 70. In the present printed edition of the Musnad, the work consists of 2,767 traditions related by 281 companions whose material is given under their names, which are arranged in the following order. I, the 4 caliphs. I, the rest of those who fought at Badr. I, the emigrants. IV, the Ansar. V, the women. VI, the youngest companions. However, at-Tayalisi, to whom the work is generally ascribed, neither compiled it nor arranged it in its present form. It is rather the work of his student, Yunus ibn Habib, who collected together the traditions which he had received from his teacher and arranged them as he saw fit. The subject matters of the traditions contained in the Musnad are as varied and numerous as those of any other collection of Hadith, but those relating to miracles, the personal or tribal values of the companions, and prophecies of future events or sects in Islam are very few. The book appears to have enjoyed great popularity until the 8th Islamic century. The Patna manuscript also bears the names of more than 300 male and female students of Hadith who had read it at different periods. Among them are found the names of great traditionists such as al-Dhahabi, al-Mizzi, and others. After the 8th century, for whatever reason, it lost its popularity, so much so that manuscripts of the book have become extremely rare. The Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. The most important and exhaustive of all the Musnad works available to us is that of Imam Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal al-Marwazi al-Shaybani. His remarkably austere, selfless life, and his firm stand for his convictions against the tyrannical inquisition and persecution launched by al-Ma'mun and continued by al-Wathiq and al-Mutawakkil created a halo of sanctity around his great collection of traditions. Despite its bulk, it survived the vicissitudes of time and was printed at Cairo in 1896. Ibn Hanbal was descended from the Arab Shaybani tribe. He was born in Marw, where his father had gone for the purpose of jihad in 780 CE, and was carefully brought up by his pious mother, Safiya bint Maymuna, in Baghdad. His father died at the age of 30, while Ahmad was quite young. He received his early education from the leading scholars of the region, and began the serious study of Hadith at the age of 15 under Ibrahim ibn Ulayya. After studying with all the major Hadith experts of the capital, he began to travel in search of knowledge in 799. He wandered through Basra, Kufa, the Yemen, the Hijaz, and other centers of hadith learning, attending the lectures of the traditionists, taking notes, and discussing them with scholars and fellow students. He finally returned to Baghdad in 810, where he met Imam al-Shafi'i, and with whom he studied fiqh and Uṣool Al-Fiqh. Ibn Hanbal began lecturing on traditions from an early age. It is said that a large number of students flocked around him in order to hear his lectures on hadith in a Baghdad mosque in the year 804, when he went there for a short time. He made the service and teaching of the Prophet's message the sole object of his life, and continued doing that until 833, when a storm of persecution erupted against the orthodox theologians throughout the Abbasid Empire. Caliph al-Ma'mun, under the influence of his philosophically minded associates, publicly accepted the Mu'tazilite creed, including the notion that the Quran was created. When most scholars refused to join him in his conversion, he first threatened and then persecuted them. Many scholars, including Imam Ahmad, refused to yield. The Caliph, who was then at Tarsus, ordered that they should be put in chains and sent to him. Although these orders were carried out, al-Ma'mun died before his devout prisoners had reached their destination. This, however, proved of little help to them. The Caliph had made a will, wherein he asked his successor to carry out his wishes with regard to the propagation of the doctrine on the creation of the Quran. His two immediate successors, al-Mu'tasim and al-Wathiq, fiercely carried out this policy, not hesitating to use torture and incarceration to persuade the Muslim scholars of the correctness of the Mu'tazilite system. This mihna, persecution, continued with varying vigor until the third year of the reign of al-Mutawakkil, who, in the year 848, finally put a stop to it and returned to mainstream Sunni belief. Some of the great traditionists, like Yahya ibn Ma'in and Ali ibn al-Madini, sought refuge behind the veil of taqiyya, dissimulation. It was Ahmad ibn Hanbal who at this critical juncture proved to be the savior of orthodoxy and the Islamic principle of the freedom of faith and conscience. He refused to submit to the dictates of the Caliph. Instead, he exposed the fallacies in the reasoning of his adversaries in public debates, and refused to buckle under their threats of force. He patiently endured their persecutions and was kept in a cell for 18 months, where he was regularly whipped by a team of executioners until his wrist was broken, he was badly wounded, and he lost consciousness. On one occasion, when he regained consciousness and was offered water, he refused it, saying that he did not want to break his fast. Nonetheless, he kept his conscience whole, and emerged from the test with the greatest credit. Even more impressively, in the eyes of the community, Ibn Hanbal showed exemplary generosity towards his enemies and persecutors, against none of whom he showed any ill will. He scrupulously refrained from expressing any opinion against Ahmad ibn Abi Du'ad, who had taken the part of chief inquisitor against him during the Mihna. After the Mihna was over, Imam Ahmad lived for about 8 years. Most of this period he devoted to teaching, while the rest he spent in prayers and the remembrance of God. He died in 855 at the age of 77. His funeral was attended by a vast crowd, said to have contained between 600,000 and 2.5 million people. It was an event the like of which must rarely have been witnessed anywhere. Throughout his life, Ibn Hanbal inspired those who knew him with his pious character. He boycotted his sons, Saleh and Abdullah, because they had accepted stipends from the Caliph. He hated luxury and met his few needs from what he himself earned. In his religious beliefs, he was extremely firm and principled, yet by nature, he was very gentle and anxious not to cause harm to anyone. Honesty and justice were the most admired elements of his character. With the exclusion of part of his final years, Imam Ahmad devoted his entire life to the service of hadith, spreading it through the large regiments of his students to every part of the Muslim world, and writing about various theological problems by presenting the relevant proof texts from the Quran and the Sunnah. 13 of these books are mentioned by Ibn al-Nadim in his Fihrist, while others, such as Kitab al-Salah, have also been published in his name. The most important of his works is without question the Musnad. The period of its compilation is unknown, but it is clear from its structure as well as its contents that it must have occupied its compiler's mind for a long time. His main object was to collect all the traditions of the Prophet ﷺ which, by his criteria, were likely to prove genuine if put to the test, and could therefore serve as a provisional basis for argument. He never claimed that all its contents were genuine or reliable. On the contrary, he struck off many traditions from his book, and even when he was on his deathbed, he asked his son to delete a hadith from the Musnad. To assemble his work, Imam Hanbal drew from his own vast store of knowledge, as well as the entire literature available to him on the subject. Out of some 750,000 narrations, he sifted 30,000 traditions narrated by 904 companions on a wide variety of subjects, such as maghazi, munaqib, rituals, laws, prophecies, and so forth. He dictated the various parts of his hadith notes to his students, and also to his sons and nephew over a period of 13 years. Although he wanted to assemble his notes in the form of a musnad, death overtook him, so that the task of arranging the material fell to his son Abdullah, who edited his father's notes. Ibn Hanbal was not strict in the choice of his materials and authorities. He included in his notes material which could not by any definition be included as hadith. Many of the traditions contained in the Musnad were declared by traditionists of a later period to be baseless and forged, mawdu', and many of the narrators relied upon by Ibn Hanbal are declared by the authorities on Asma'ul Rijal to be of dubious worth. Most famous of these is Abdullah bin Lahiha, 715 to 790, over whose credentials a lively controversy continues to rage. There are, however, many virtues in Ibn Hanbal's work. If he received a hadith from more than one narrator, he pointed out the slightest difference that may exist between them. Ibn Hanbal's son, Abdullah Abu Abdirrahman, maintained the scrupulous care and thoroughness of his father when editing the material he inherited. He collated the whole of his father's huge but incomplete manuscript with his own notes, which he had taken at his lectures and at the sessions of other traditionists. He also collated it with what he had learnt from him and others during more general learned discussions. Ibn Hanbal's Musnad occupies an important place in hadith literature and has served as an important source for various writers on the different genres of Arabic literature. Of the numerous scholars and authors who use the Musnad as a subject for their commentary or adaptations, or as a source for their own works or compilations, we may mention here just a few. Abu Umar Muhammad ibn Wahid, d. 956, re-edited the book and added certain supplementary traditions. Al-Bawarti, the lexicographer, d. 1155, based his Gharib al-Hadith entirely on this book. Izzuddin ibn al-Athir, d. 1234, used it as one of his sources for his biographical dictionary, the Uṣool Al-Ḥadeeth. Ibn Hajar, d. 1505, included it among the most important works upon which he based his atraf. Sirajuddin Umar ibn al-Mulakkin, d. 1402, made a synopsis of it. As-Suyuti, d. 1505, used it as the basis for his grammatical treatise, Uqud al-Zabarjad. Abdul Hasan Umar ibn al-Hadi as-Sindi, d. 1726, wrote a large commentary on it, and Zainuddin Umar ibn Ahmad al-Shamma al-Halabi made a selection from it, which he called Al-Muntaqa min Musnad Ahmad. Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Abdullah re-edited it, arranging their traditions in the alphabetical order of the names of their original narrators. Nasiruddin ibn Zurayk prepared another edition of it in the form of a MUSANNAF, while Abdul Hasan al-Haythami gathered its traditions which were not found in the 6 canonical compilations. Other Musnad works. Like At-Tayalisi and Ibn Hanbal, many other traditionists compiled Musnad works along the same lines, with certain differences in the details of internal structure. These include Abu Muhammad Abdul Hamid ibn Humayd, d. 863, Abu Awana, d. 929, Ibn Abi Shayba, d. 849, Ishaq ibn Rahaway, d. 852, Al-Humaydi, d. 834, Abu Ya'la, d. 919, and others. The Musannaf works. Still more important than the Musnad works are the collections known as Musannaf. To this genre belong the most important of all hadith collections, such as the Sahihs of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, the JAAMI of At-Tirmidhi, and also the Sunan works, such as those of An-Nasa'i and Abu Dawud. The early Musannaf works are mostly lost. The Musannaf of Waqi', d. 812 CE, for instance, is known to us only through references in later works. The Musannaf of Abdur Razzaq. The earliest Musannaf work in existence is the Musannaf of Abu Bakr Abdur Razzaq ibn Hammam, 743 to 826, of Sana'a in Yemen, which has been skillfully edited and published by the Indian scholar Habibur Rahman al-A'zami. Abdur Razzaq began his study of Hadith at the age of 20. He stayed in the company of Ma'mar for 7 years, learning Hadith from him, and studied under other leading authorities, such as Ibn Jurayj, until he himself became one of the most outstanding Hadith experts in his day. Many later authorities acknowledge their debt to him, including traditionists like Yahya ibn Ma'in and Ahmad ibn Hanbal. It is said that after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, people never traveled in such a large number to meet anyone as they did to Abdur Razzaq. His compilation was divided in accordance with the fiqh classification into various books, in each of which the hadiths are distributed according to subject. The final chapter is Ash-Shama'il, and the very last hadith is about the Prophet's hair. The Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shaybah. The Musannaf of Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abi Shaybah, d. 849 CE, is even more exhaustive than that of Abdur Razzaq. His grandfather worked as judge of Wasid during the reign of Al-Mansur, and his family produced many traditionists. Based at Kufa, he himself related traditions to leading figures such as Abu Zar'a, Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal. His Musannaf, which is considered an early source of the first importance, has recently been printed in 13 volumes. The Sahih of Al-Bukhari. The most important of all Musannaf works, indeed, of all the Hadith collections, is of course Al-Jami' al-Sahih of Al-Bukhari. The compiler is said to have questioned more than 1,000 Hadith scholars, who lived in places as far apart as Balkh, Merv, Nishapur, the Hijaz, Egypt, and Iraq. Al-Bukhari used to seek aid and prayer before recording every tradition, and weighed every word he wrote with scrupulous exactitude. He devoted more than a quarter of his life to the creation of his Sahih, which is generally considered by the Muslims as an authority second only to the Quran. Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, who was born in Bukhara in the year 810 CE, was of Persian origin. His ancestor, Bardizbah, was a farmer in the vicinity of Bukhara, who was taken captive during the Muslim conquest of the region. Bardizbah's son, who took the name al-Mughira, accepted Islam at the hand of al-Yaman al-Ju'fi, the Muslim governor of Bukhara, and gained from him the surname al-Ju'fi. Al-Mughira's son, Ibrahim, the grandfather of our author, had a son called Ismail, who became a traditionist of great piety and sound reputation. He studied under a number of famous scholars of Hadith, such as Malik ibn Anas, Hammad ibn Zayd, and Ibn al-Mubarak. Scrupulous in his habits, he is said to have mentioned on his deathbed that in all he possessed there was not a penny that had not been earned by his own honest labor. Like many scholars of his time, Al-Bukhari began his educational career under the guidance of his mother in his native city. Finishing his elementary studies at the age of 11, he immersed himself in the study of Hadith. Within 6 years, he had mastered the knowledge of all the traditionists of Bukhara, as well as everything contained in the books that were available to him. Al-Bukhari not only memorized the hadiths in the books of the scholars, he also memorized the biographies of all the narrators in their chains of narrators, their dates, and places of birth, death, etc. He then traveled to Mecca with his mother and brother in order to perform the pilgrimage. From the holy city, he started a series of journeys in quest of hadith, passing through all the important centers of Islamic learning, staying in each place as long as he needed, meeting the traditionists, learning all the hadiths they knew, and communicating his own knowledge to them. It is recorded that he stayed at Basra for 4 or 5 years, and in the Hijaz for 6. He also traveled to Egypt twice, and to Kufa and Baghdad many times. Imam Bukhari's travels continued for some 4 decades. In the year 864, he came to the great Central Asian city of Nishapur, where he was given a grand reception suitable to a traditionist of his rank. Here, he devoted himself to the teaching of tradition and wished to settle down. But he was obliged to leave the town due to the rivalry of the traditionalist Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Thuhali when he refused to accept a request to deliver lectures on Hadith at the palace of Khalid ibn Ahmad al-Thuhali. From Nishapur, he travelled on to Kartank, a village near Bukhara, at the request of its inhabitants. Here he settled down and died in the year 870. Throughout his life, al-Bukhari displayed the character of a pious Muslim scholar. He was rigorous in the observance of his religious duties, and he earned his livelihood by means of trade, in which he was scrupulously honest. A good deal of his income, in fact, was spent on helping the students and the poor. It is said that he never showed an ill temper to anyone, even when there was more than sufficient cause, nor did he bear ill will against anybody. Even towards those who had caused his exile from Nishapur, he harbored no grudge. Since the very outset of his career, al-Bukhari showed the signs of greatness. It is said that at the age of 11, he pointed out a mistake of one of his teachers. The teacher laughed at the audacity of the young student, but al-Bukhari persisted in his correction and challenged his teacher to refer to his book, which justified the pupil's contention. On many occasions, al-Bukhari's learning was put to severe tests of a kind often favoured by rigorous scholars of the time, and he seems always to have emerged with credit. At Baghdad, 10 traditionists changed the isnads and contents of 100 hadiths, recited them to al-Bukhari at a public meeting, and asked him questions about them. Al-Bukhari first confessed his ignorance of the traditions that they had recited, but then he recited the correct versions of all the traditions concerned, and said that probably his questioners had inadvertently recited them wrongly. At Samarkand, 400 students tested al-Bukhari's knowledge in the same way, and al-Bukhari succeeded in exposing their interpolations. These repeated trials and triumphs of al-Bukhari won him recognition as the greatest traditionist of his time by all the major authorities with whom he came in contact, including Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Ali ibn al-Madini, Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, and others. Al-Bukhari's writings began during his stay in Medina at the age of 18, when he compiled his earliest 2 books. One of these contained the decrees and judgments of the companions and the successors, while the other was made up of short biographies of the important narrators of traditions during his own lifetime. A large number of other collections followed. A list is furnished by his biographers, Muqaddama Fathul Bari and Irshad Sari, as well as the Fihrist. The Sahih, commonly known as Sahih al-Bukhari, is the most important of his books. It is said to have been heard by 90,000 of the author's students, and is considered by almost all traditionists to be the most reliable collection of hadith. Bukhari got the idea to compile the Sahih from a casual remark made by Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, 782 to 852, who said that he wished that a traditionist would compile a short but comprehensive book containing only genuine traditions. These words seem to have fired al-Bukhari's imagination, and he set to work with indefatigable energy and care. He sifted through all the traditions known to him, tested their genuineness according to canons of criticism he himself developed, and selected 9,082 out of some 600,000 narrations of hadiths. If repetitions are excluded, the actual number of hadiths goes down to 2,062. He arranged them according to their subject matter under separate headings, most of which are taken from the Quran, and in some cases from the traditions themselves. Because al-Bukhari nowhere mentions what canons of criticism he applied to the traditions to test their genuineness, or tells us why he compiled the book, many later scholars have tried to infer these things from the text itself. Al-Hazimi, in his Shurutul A'imma, Al-Iraqi, in his Alfiya, Al-Aini and Al-Kastalani, in their introductions to their commentaries on the Sahih, and many other writers on the hadith sciences, including Ibn as-Salah, have tried to deduce Bukhari's principles from the material he presents. Al-Bukhari's main object was to collect together the sound traditions only. Al-Bukhari includes in his work the narrations of narrators when they explicitly state that they had received the traditions from their own authorities. If their statement in this regard was ambiguous, he took care that they had demonstrably met their teachers, and were not known for careless statements. However, it would be a mistake to suppose that the Sahih is absolutely free of defects. In estimating the reliability of the narrators, his judgment has in certain cases been incorrect, and the Muslim traditionists have pointed this out. Ad-Daraqutni, 918 to 995, tried to show the weakness of some 200 traditions contained in the book in his work Al-Istidrak wa Tatabbu', which has been summarized by Al-Jazairi in his Tawjih Nazar. According to As-Suyuti, criticism concerned some 80 narrators and 110 hadiths. The criticism showed that though these hadiths were not mistaken or false, they did not measure up to the high standards which al-Bukhari had set. For example, At-Tirmidhi said, "The hadiths of Ibn Abi Layla cannot be used as evidence." Muhammad ibn Ismail said, "Ibn Abi Layla is saduq, truthful. However, I didn't narrate from him because he doesn't know his authentic narrations from his weak ones, and anyone like that I don't narrate from." Abu Mas'ud of Damascus and Abu Ali al-Ghassani have also criticized some of the narrations in the Sahih, while Al-Aini in his celebrated commentary has shown the defects of some of its contents. The Sahih of Muslim. The position of Bukhari's Sahih in the literature is not unrivaled. Another Sahih was being compiled almost simultaneously, which was considered its superior by some, its equal by others, and second to it by most. This was the Sahih of Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj ibn Muslim of the Arab Kushairi clan from Nishapur. Very little is known about Muslim's early life. It is said that he was born in 817, and that having learnt and excelled in the usual disciplines at a precocious age, focused his attention on Hadith. In its pursuit, he travelled widely, visiting all the important centers of learning in Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. He attended the lectures of most of the great traditionists of his day, including Ishaq ibn Rahawai, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Ubaydullah al-Kawariri, Shuwayh ibn Yunus, Abdullah ibn Maslama, and Hamala ibn Yahya. He settled down at Nishapur, earning a living from a small business, and devoted the remainder of his time to the service of the prophetic Sunnah. He died in the year 874. His character is said to have been admirable. His fearless loyalty to the truth is shown by his persistence in associating with al-Bukhari, while others had deserted him on the account of Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Thuhali's accusations. Like Bukhari, too, he wrote a good number of books and treatises on Hadith and on related subjects. Ibn al-Nadim mentions 5 books by him on the subject. Haji Khalifa adds the names of many other works by him in the same field. In his Sahih, he examined 1/3 hadiths, from which he selected only about 4,000, which the traditionists unanimously regarded as sound. Like al-Bukhari, Muslim regarded a hadith as sahih only when it had been handed down to him through a continuous isnad of known and reliable authorities, was compatible with other material established in this way, and was free from various types of deficiency. He adopted a 3-fold classification of hadiths. Firstly, there were those which had been related by narrators who were straightforward and steadfast in their narrations, did not differ much in them from other reliable narrators, and did not commit any palpable confusion in their reports. Secondly, there were traditions whose narrators were not distinguished for their retentive memory and steadfastness in narrations. Thirdly, there were the hadiths narrated on the authority of people whom all or most traditionists declared were of questionable reliability. According to Imam Muslim, the first group makes up the bulk of his book. The second is included as corroborative of the first, while the third is entirely rejected. Upon completing his Sahih, Imam Muslim presented it to Abu Zar'a of Ray, a traditionist of great repute, for his comments. Abu Zar'a inspected it closely, and Muslim deleted everything which he thought was defective, and retained only such traditions as was declared by him to be genuine. Thus, carefully compiled by Muslim, and proofread by Abu Zar'a, the Sahih has been acclaimed as the most authentic collection of traditions after that of al-Bukhari, and superior to the latter in the details of its arrangement. Some traditionists hold it to be superior to the work of al-Bukhari in every respect. After Muslim, a number of other scholars also compiled Sahih collections. These include Ibn Khuzaymah, d. 925, Abu Hatim Muhammad ibn Hibban, d. 965, and others. None of them, however, ever gained the recognition and popularity that the Muslim community has accorded the definitive achievements of Al-Bukhari and Muslim. The Sunan works. The Sunan works constitute the richest branch of Hadith literature. Since the earliest period of Islam, the traditionists attached greater importance to legal and doctrinal reports than they did to accounts of a historical, maghazi nature, arguing that the precise date of the Prophet's departure from Badr, for instance, was of no practical utility for a Muslim. They felt that attention should instead be focused on topics of relevance to a Muslim's daily life, such as ablutions, prayers, sales, marriages, etc. This emphasis on hadiths of a practical nature grew even more pronounced after the second half of the 3rd century. Most of the traditionists compiled hadith collections of the Sunan alone. Such are the works of Abu Dawud as-Sijistani, At-Tirmidhi, An-Nasa'i, Ad-Darimi, Ibn Majah, Ad-Daraqutni, and a considerable number of others. The Sunan of Abu Dawud. This work, which is among the most important of the hadith anthologies, is the work of Abu Dawud Sulaiman ibn al-Ash'ath as-Sijistani, who is said to have examined 500,000 hadiths and selected 4,800 for his book, a labor which occupied him for 20 years in Tarsus. Abu Dawud was a descendant of Imran of the Azd tribe, who was killed during the Battle of Siffin on the side of Ali. Abu Dawud himself was born in 817 in the well-known region of Sijistan in Khorasan. When his elementary education was complete, he joined a school in Nishapur at the age of 10. There, he studied under Muhammad ibn Aslam, d. 856. He then traveled to Basra, where he received the bulk of his hadith training. In 838, he visited Kufa, and from there he began a series of journeys in search of hadith, which took him to the Hijaz, Iraq, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. He met most of the foremost traditionists of his time, and acquired from them a profound knowledge of the traditions which were available. Abu Dawud's travels regularly took him to the metropolis of Baghdad. Once, while staying in that city, he was visited by Abu Ahmad al-Muwaffaq, the celebrated commander and brother of the Caliph al-Mu'tamid. When Abu Dawud inquired as to the purpose of his visit, al-Muwaffaq replied that his objective was threefold. Firstly, he wished to invite Abu Dawud to reside at Basra, which had become deserted on account of the Zanj insurrection, in the hope that it would be repopulated if famous scholars and their students moved there. Secondly, he requested Abu Dawud to give classes to his family. Thirdly, he asked him to make these classes private, so that ordinary students would be excluded. Abu Dawud accepted the first two requests, but expressed his inability to comply with the third. In his view, all were equal regarding knowledge, and Abu Dawud would not tolerate any distinction between rich and poor students. The result was that al-Muwaffaq's sons attended his lectures side by side with anyone else that wished to attend. This anecdote, preserved for us by as-Subki, throws light not just on the great reputation enjoyed by Abu Dawud as a scholar and a man of principle, but also on the date of his final settlement at Basra. This is unlikely to have occurred before the year 883, when the Zanj insurrection was finally crushed. Abu Dawud died at Basra in the year 888, at the age of 73. He was noted for his encyclopedic knowledge of traditions, his photographic memory, his upright character, and his kindness. One of his most celebrated books on traditions and sacred law is his Sunan, which is not only regarded as the first work of its type in the hadith literature, but is generally seen as the best and most reliable. It is divided into books which are subdivided into chapters. Although Abu Dawud retained the scrupulous exactitude of his predecessors in reproducing the material which he collected, he differed from them in the criteria of selection. In his Sunan, he included not only the Sahih traditions, but also some other accounts that had been classed by other scholars as weak or doubtful. Among the narrators, he relied not only on those who had been unanimously declared acceptable, but also on others who were the subject of criticism. In his opinion, a weak hadith, if not very weak, was better than the personal opinion of the scholars. This was not necessarily a defect in his book, as some critics, such as Al-Shubba, had in fact been overly strict in their criticisms of the narrators. Nonetheless, Abu Dawud collected the most reliable traditions known to him on every subject of fiqh, quoting the sources through which the traditions had reached him, together with the various versions of the accounts in question. He draws attention to the defects of certain of the traditions he cites, as well as the relative value of the variant texts. In the case of the traditions which he believed to be genuine, however, he makes no comments whatsoever. He also often took only those parts of long hadiths which were relevant to the chapter in which they were included. The following remarks made by Abu Dawud in connection with some of his traditions give us a general idea of the method and nature of his criticism. Abu Dawud says, "This is an inauthentic, munkar hadith. Certainly it is related by Ibn Jurayj, from Ziyad ibn Sa'd, from Az-Zuhri, from Anas, that he said that the Prophet ﷺ had put on a ring made of palm leaf, which he in time discarded. The mistake in this hadith is to be attributed to Hammam, as no other narrator has related it." In connection with a further hadith, after giving two versions of it, he remarks, "The account related by Anas is more correct than the other." Since the author collected traditions which no one else had ever assembled together, it has been accepted as a standard work by scholars of a wide variety of schools, particularly in Iraq, Egypt, North Africa, and many other parts of the Islamic world. Sunan Abi Dawud is the most comprehensive of the Sunan with regard to legal hadiths. Many commentaries have been written on the book, and the best one available is that of Shamsul Haq Azim Abadi, Aunul Ma'bud Sharh Sunan Abi Dawud. Another very important work has been published under the title Tahdhib Sunan Abi Dawud, edited by Ahmad Shakir and others in 8 volumes in Cairo. It contains the books of Mundhiri and Ibn al-Qayyim. The Sunan of At-Tirmidhi. The general principles with regard to the criticism of hadith, which had been adopted by Abu Dawud, were further improved upon and followed by his student Abu Isa Muhammad ibn Isa ibn Sawra ibn Musa ad-Dahhak at-Tirmidhi in his compilation, which he called Al-JAAMI. This work contains the bulk of the traditions, legal, theological, and historical, that have been accepted by the jurists of the main juridical tendencies as the basis of Islamic law. At-Tirmidhi was born at Makkah in the year 821. He traveled a good deal in search of traditions, visiting the great centers of Islamic learning in Iraq, Persia, and Khorasan, where he was able to associate with eminent traditionists such as Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, and others. He returned to his hometown in the province of Khorasan in 862 and compiled his Jami' after that. It was completed some 28 years later. Abu Isa died at Tirmidh in 892. Like Abu Dawud, At-Tirmidhi possessed a remarkably sharp and retentive memory, which was severely tested many times. It is related that during an early stage of his travels, a traditionist once dictated to him several traditions which occupy 16 pages, which, however, were lost by At-Tirmidhi before he could revise them. He met the traditionist again after some time and requested him to recite some traditions. The teacher suggested that he would read out from his manuscript the same traditions that he had dictated to At-Tirmidhi during their previous meeting, and that At-Tirmidhi should compare his notes with what he heard. Instead of telling the traditionist that he had misplaced his notes, At-Tirmidhi picked up some blank sheets of paper in his hand and looked into them as though they contained his notes, while the teacher began to read his book. However, the teacher soon noticed the trick and grew angry at the young student's conduct. At-Tirmidhi, however, explained that he remembered every word of what had been dictated to him. The teacher was reluctant to believe him and challenged him to recite the traditions from his memory. At-Tirmidhi accepted this challenge and proceeded to recite all the traditions without committing a single mistake. At this, the teacher doubted his statement that he had not been able to revise from his notes, and decided to test his student by reciting 40 other traditions and ask At-Tirmidhi to reproduce them. Without hesitation, At-Tirmidhi repeated what he had heard verbatim, and his teacher, convinced now of the truth of his statement, declared his pleasure and satisfaction at the young man's powers of retention. At-Tirmidhi's Jami', assembled through the use of this gift, is recognized as one of the most important works of Hadith literature and is unanimously included among the 6 canonical collections of Hadith. It contains altogether 3,956 Hadiths. Not only did he take great pains to determine the identity, names, titles, and pet names of each narrator in the traditions he cited, he also attempted to state the degree of reliability and how the jurists of the various schools of law used them. He also added a note to almost every hadith, prefaced with the words, Abu Isa says. He then proceeded to state a range of points connected with the tradition. The following example will show the nature and importance of these notes. Qutayba, Hannad, Abu Quraib, Ahmed ibn Mani', Mahmud ibn Ghailan, and Abu Ammar have related to us, saying that Waqi' related to them, from Al-A'mash, from Habib ibn Abi Thabit, from Urwa, from Aisha, that the Prophet ﷺ once kissed one of his wives, and then went out to offer prayers without performing ablution. Urwa asked Aisha, "Who could that be but yourself?" And Aisha laughed. Abu Isa says, a similar tradition has been related by many of those who possess knowledge among the companions and the followers, and this is the opinion of Sufyan al-Thawri and the jurists of Kufa, who hold that a kiss does not invalidate one's ablution. Malik ibn Anas, Al-Awza'i, Ash-Shafi'i, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, and Ishaq ibn Rahawai, however, hold that a kiss does invalidate ablution, and this is the opinion of many learned companions and successors. Our people, Malik, Ahmed et al., did not follow the hadith related by Aisha from the Prophet ﷺ because it did not appear to be genuine to them on the account of its isnad. I heard Abu Bakr al-Attar of Basra quote Ali ibn al-Madini, who said that Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan declared this tradition to be weak, and said that it was useless. I also heard Muhammad ibn Ismail call it a weak tradition, saying that Habib ibn Abi Thabit never heard any traditions from Urwa. Ibrahim at-Taymi also related from Aisha that the Prophet ﷺ kissed her and did not perform ablutions afterwards. But this too is not genuine, because Ibrahim at-Taymi is not known to have heard this tradition from Aisha. As a matter of fact, nothing that has been imputed to the Prophet ﷺ on this subject can be called genuine. The above example should suffice to demonstrate the nature of the remarks appended by Abu Isa to the traditions of his JAAMI. He categorized the hadith as Sahih, sound, Hasan, fair, Sahih Hasan, sound fair, Hasan Sahih, fair sound, Gharib, rare, Da'if, weak, or Munkar, rejected. But perhaps the most important feature of the JAAMI, as far as assessments of reliability are concerned, is the category of Hasan. Most of the traditions on which many of the rites and laws of religion are based belong to this class. Al-Bukhari, Ibn Hanbal, and others had already used the term but rather sparingly, and in a loose and non-technical sense. Abu Isa realized the importance of these hadiths as a source of law, defined the term for the first time, and applied it to those traditions which fulfilled its requirements. To determine this class of traditions and the degree of their reliability, At-Tirmidhi describes some of them as Sahih Hasan, some as Hasan, and others as Hasan Gharib. But he was not quite as consistent in his use of the term Hasan, and many traditionists have criticized him on this account. There have been many commentaries written on this work. The best one available at present is the work of Abdurrahman Mubarak Puri, entitled Tuhfatul Ahwathi, in 4 volumes, and has been reprinted several times. The Sunan of An-Nasa'i. Another important work in this category is that compiled by Abu Abdurrahman Ahmad ibn Shu'aib An-Nasa'i, who was born in the year 827, 6 or 7 years after At-Tirmidhi, at Nasa, a town in Khorasan. Having received his early education in his home province, he traveled at the age of 15 to Balkh, where he studied hadiths with Qutayba ibn Sa'id for over a year. He traveled widely in pursuit of hadith, to Iraq, Arabia, Syria, etc., and settled down in Egypt, where one of his teachers, Yunus ibn Abdil A'la, was living. In 914 he went to Damascus, where he found the people holding erroneous views against Ali ibn Abi Talib due to the past influence of the Umayyads. In order to guide the people, he composed a book on the merits of Ali and wanted to read it from the pulpit of a mosque, but the congregation, instead of giving him a patient hearing, maltreated him, beat him, and drove him from the mosque. He died in the year 915, perhaps as a result of this incident. An-Nasa'i was recognized as the leading traditionist of his day. Abdullah ibn Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Muhammad ibn Ibrahim, Ali ibn Umar, and other major traditionists regarded him as such. His scrupulousness is evident from the fact that in connection with the traditions related by his teacher, Al-Harith ibn Miskin, he never used the term haddathana or akhbarana as he did in the case of those traditions which had reached him via other scholars. For although the materials he acquired from Al-Harith were read by the latter in a public class, An-Nasa'i had been prohibited from attending, and thus was obliged to hear them by concealing himself at the gate of the lecture hall. He would write, "I heard this hadith while it was read to Al-Harith ibn Miskin." In his large work on Sunan, which he confessed contained a fair number of weak and dubious traditions, An-Nasa'i compiled the legal traditions which he considered to be either fairly reliable or of possible reliability. At the request of some of his friends, he also produced a synopsis of the Sunan, called Al-Mujtaba, or As-Sunan As-Sughra. This latter work, which he claimed contained only reliable traditions, is now accepted as one of the 6 canonical collections. In As-Sunan As-Sughra, An-Nasa'i entirely ignores the point of view of his contemporary At-Tirmidhi, who had sought to apply traditions to specific problems and arranged his book accordingly. An-Nasa'i's main object was only to establish the text of traditions and record the divergences between their various versions, almost all of which he extensively quotes, instead of merely referring to them, as Abu Dawood and At-Tirmidhi had done. In many places, he gives headings to the differences between the various narrators, and mentions the smallest differences between them. In some cases, after giving the various versions of a hadith, An-Nasa'i points out that some of them are incorrect. He is known, likewise, for his strictness in assessing and selecting his authorities. In fact, it is said that his principles of criticism were more rigorous than those of Muslim. The book does, however, contain many weak and doubtful traditions related by unknown narrators of questionable credentials. An-Nasa'i's Sunan did not attract the attention of early scholars with regard to commentary. As-Suyuti wrote a short commentary called Zahrur Raba' al-Mujtaba more than 500 years later. The Sunan of Ad-Darimi. This is among the earliest Sunan works to have come down to us. Its author, Abu Muhammad Abdullah ibn Abdirrahman, 797 to 868, was a member of the Arabian clan of the Banu Darim, an offshoot of the tribe of Tamim. Like many of his contemporaries, he traveled a good deal in search of hadiths and studied under important traditionists such as Yazid ibn Harun and Sa'id ibn Amir. Well known for his devotion to his field, he was also celebrated for his honesty and piety. When offered a post as judge at Samarkand, he refused, afraid he might commit an injustice, until he was pressed hard to accept, and he resigned after judging only one case. The Sunan of Ad-Darimi contains some 3,550 traditions, arranged in 1,408 chapters, according to subject matter. One special feature of the book is its general introductory chapter, in which the compiler presents a number of hadiths connected with a range of matters, including certain usages of the Arabs before Islam, traditions connected with the life and character of the Prophet ﷺ, material related to the written recording of hadiths, and the great importance of knowledge. In the main body of the text, Ad-Darimi follows the same plan as the later Sunan compilers. After citing a group of traditions, he adds notes, in some of which he offers his own opinion on certain problems, identifies some narrators, or criticizes their reliability, or draws attention to variant versions of a tradition. These notes, however, are much briefer than those appended to the previously mentioned Sunan works. The book is generally accepted as an important source and has been regarded by some traditionists as the 6th of the canonical collections. It never, however, attained the position of any of the former three works, because it contains more weak and defective traditions than they do. The Sunan of Ibn Majah. Most hadith scholars prefer the Sunan of Ibn Majah, 824 to 886, to the work of Ad-Darimi, including it in the sound 6 collections. Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Yazid ibn Rabi', commonly known as Ibn Majah, was born in Qazwin. He began the study of hadith in his late teens and visited the important centers of learning in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, and studied under the great traditionists of his day. Ibn Majah compiled several works in the area of hadith, the most important being his Sunan. In this work, the author collected 4,341 traditions, distributed over 32 books and 1,500 chapters. Out of them, 3,002 have been recorded by authors of the remaining 5 books. Of the remaining 1,339 hadiths, which were recorded by Ibn Majah alone, 428 were sahih, 199 were hasan, 613 were da'if, and 99 were munkar, fabrications. It is said that after completing the book, Ibn Majah presented it for criticism to Abu Zar'a, recognized as the most competent hadith critic of the day. Abu Zar'a liked the general plan of the book and remarked that he expected it to supersede the hadith works that then enjoyed general currency. He also noted that the number of weak traditions in the book was not large. Despite this approbation, however, it emerges that the book does in fact include many forged traditions. Ibn al-Jawzi has declared in his work, Al-Mawdu'at, that all the traditions on the merits of individuals or tribes or towns are forged, and many such traditions are found in Sunan Ibn Majah. Although other scholars of the Sunan also recorded weak traditions, they mostly noted them in their books. However, Ibn Majah made no mention of the weak traditions in his work. Scholars like Ibn al-Athir, d. 606 AH, Ibn Hajar, d. 852 AH, and Kastallani, d. 923 AH, disliked including this book among the sound 6. The main features of Sunan Ibn Majah are that it has very little repetition and is one of the best in arrangement of chapters and subchapters. The Sunan of Ad-Daraqutni. Another Sunan work of importance was compiled by Abul Hasan Ali ibn Umar, 918 to 995, generally known as Ad-Daraqutni, on account of his residence in the Baghdad urban quarter known as Darqutn. Ad-Daraqutni rapidly acquired a sound foundation in Arabic literature and the Islamic sciences, in particular the traditions and the variant readings, qira'at, of the Quran. His book on the latter subject is acknowledged as the first work of its type, and most later authors follow its general plan. Among his students, who recognized his wide and critical knowledge of hadith, were Al-Hakim, Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani, whose book The Hilyatul Awliya is said to be the best work of Muslim hagiography, Tammam of Ray, and the traditionist Abdul Ghani ibn Sa'id. Al-Hakim in particular, who narrates traditions from about 2,000 individuals, remarked that he never met a scholar like Ad-Daraqutni, whose knowledge proved encyclopedic, whatever subject was broached. Almost every traditionist who came to Baghdad made a point of visiting him. Abu Mansur ibn al-Karki, while compiling his own Musnad, depended on Ad-Daraqutni's help in identifying defective traditions, while Abu Bakr al-Barkani based a work on hadith on notes dictated by Ad-Daraqutni to Abu Mansur. He likewise rendered material help in the compilation of a Musnad work by Ibn Hinzaba, the able and learned minister of the Ikhshidi rulers of Egypt. Having learned that this Musnad was being compiled, Ad-Daraqutni traveled from Baghdad to Egypt, where he remained until the work was completed. Throughout this period, Ibn Hinzaba showed him immense deference and respect, and upon completion bestowed upon him rich rewards. Ad-Daraqutni himself compiled many useful works on hadith and related subjects. The Sunan was recognized as one of the most reliable hadith collections, next in importance only to the Sound 6. It was used by al-Baghawi, d. 1122, as one of the chief sources for his influential Masabih al-Sunnah, which in turn formed the basis for the Mishkatul Masabih of At-Tabrizi. In his Sunan, Daraqutni adduces traditions he considers reasonably authentic, supplementing them with isnads and alternate versions. Of the very first hadith, for instance, he gives 5 different versions, with 5 separate chains of authority, some of which he adjudges weak. To some traditions, he adds notes in which he attempts to fix their degree of reliability and the identity of some of their narrators, and assesses their character and reliability. However, the number of weak traditions in his Sunan is fairly large. It is, at any rate, larger than in any of the Sunan works conventionally included in the canonical 6, and has hence not been included among them. The Sunan of Al-Bayhaqi. After Ad-Daraqutni came Abu Bakr Ahmad ibn al-Husayn of Bayhaq, a group of villages near Nishapur. Al-Bayhaqi was born in 994 CE and studied tradition under more than 100 eminent traditionists of his time, including Al-Hakim an-Nisaburi, of whom he became the most eminent pupil. Having excelled in the various Islamic sciences, Al-Bayhaqi soon became a remarkably prolific author, producing several hundred books on Hadith and Shafi'i law, some of which are said to be unparalleled in the history of the literature. His 2 Sunan works, of an unusual length and thoroughness, are particularly revered. His reputation as a traditionist and a jurist attracted the attention of the learned of Nishapur, who invited him to their city and requested him to read one of his books to them. He died in the year 1065 CE. The Sunan of Sa'id ibn Mansur. Less well known, but earlier than all the Sunan works so far mentioned, is the Sunan of Abu Uthman Sa'id ibn Mansur ibn Shu'bah, d. 841. He was born at Merv and brought up in the city of Balkh. Ibn Mansur wandered throughout a large part of the Muslim world, finally settling at Makkah. Ibn Mansur learned traditions from a range of prominent experts, including Imam Malik, Hammad, Abu Awana, and others, and in turn instructed another group of luminaries such as Muslim, Abu Dawud, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, all of whom spoke of his scholarship in terms of the highest veneration. His Sunan, in which he is said to have had great confidence, appears to have been compiled towards the end of his life. It contains a large number of traditions received from the Prophet ﷺ through only 3 intermediaries. The Sunan of Abu Muslim al-Kashi. Abu Muslim Ibrahim ibn Abdullah al-Kashi, d. 895, was from a village called Kash, located in Khuzestan. After studying traditions under Abu Asim an-Nabil, Abu Awana, and others, he visited Baghdad, where he delivered lectures on Hadith. These soon attracted a remarkably large number of students, so many in fact that his voice was not audible to them all, and 7 men had to be appointed to repeat his words to various parts of the audience. Like the compilation of Ibn Mansur, his Sunan is said to have contained many reports transmitted through only 3 narrators. The Mu'jam works. Although the Mu'jam works never acquired the esteem accorded the collections of Sunan, many were compiled and are still extensively used. They differ in form from one author to another. Sometimes it is arranged according to alphabetical names of the companions, other times according to regions, and yet other times according to the alphabetical names of teachers of compilers. The Mu'jam of At-Tabarani. The best known Mu'jams are those of Abdul Qasim Sulaiman ibn Ahmad ibn Ayyub At-Tabarani. At-Tabarani was born in Tiberias, then a flourishing Muslim city, in 873. His family belonged to the Lakum tribe from Yemen, which had migrated to Quds. Al-Dhahabi mentioned that At-Tabarani began his study of Hadith at the age of 13 in Tabariya. A year later, he went to Quds to further his studies. On his academic travels, he visited most of the important centers of learning in Syria, Egypt, the Hijaz, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran, acquiring traditions from about 1,000 narrators. At-Tabarani spent 30 years learning Hadith and the number of his teachers exceeds 1,000. He finally settled at Isfahan in 902, where a pension was fixed for him by the governor Ibn Rustum. There he lived a quiet life for 70 years, teaching hadith and compiling a number of books on the subject, dying at last in 970 at the age of 100. Of his works, a list of which is provided by Al-Thahabi, the most important are his 3 mu'jams. The largest of these, commonly known as the Great Mu'jam, Al-Mu'jam Al-Kabir, is in fact a musnad work. Its 12 volumes contain about 25,000 traditions that have been collected together under the names of the various companions by whom they are narrated, the names being presented alphabetically. It contains a great deal of historical information along with the hadiths. This book absorbed totally or partially hundreds of earlier works. The medium mu'jam, Al-Mu'jam Al-Awsat, is in 6 volumes and contains the rare traditions narrated to the compiler by his teachers, whose names, together with their traditions, are set out, again, alphabetically. The author took great pride in this work, which, although contains a number of weak traditions, demonstrates his wide knowledge of the subject. Finally, there is Tabarani's lesser mu'jam, Al-Mu'jam Al-Saghir, which was his first mu'jam, and which contains only one tradition narrated by each of his teachers. Although these are the best known works of the type, many other mu'jam works were compiled, some of which are listed by Haji Khalifa. The JAAMI works. Some generations later, after the eras of the classics, another genre of hadith works appeared in which scholars gathered the narrations from existing works and arranged them in a variety of ways. The JAAMI of Ibn al-Athir. Al-Mubarak ibn Muhammad ibn Abdul Karim al-Jazari belonged to a famous literary family. His brother, Ali, was a historian famous for his Al-Kamil fi Tarikh, and his other brother, Nasrullah, was the author of many literary works. All 3 of them are known by the title Ibn al-Athir. Our author, the Muhaddith, was born in 554 AH in Jazira of Ibn Umar, a town north of Mosul. In 565 AH, he moved to Mosul and made it his permanent residence. He became the leading scholar of his time in the Arabic language, exegesis of the Quran, Hadith, and Fiqh. Ibn al-Athir held important advisory posts in successive governments. Later, he became ill with gout in his legs and was unable to stretch his legs or walk. All of his literary works were productions of his days of illness. Ibn al-Athir used to dictate to his students, and they would write for him. His An-Nihaya fi Gharib al-Hadith is a very important work for researchers and scholars for understanding the meanings of unusual words used in hadith literature. However, his main work was Jami' al-Uṣool fi Ahadith al-Rasul, in which he collected all the hadiths recorded in Al-Muwaṭṭa, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Jami' al-Tirmidhi, Sunan Abi Dawud, and Sunan an-Nasa'i. He omitted the SUNADs and arranged the chapters in alphabetical order. The best edition of this work is that of Abdul Qadir al-Arnaoud of Damascus. The Zawaid work of Al-Haythami. Ali ibn Abi Bakr ibn Sulaiman al-Haythami, 735 to 807 AH, studied the Quran after reaching the age of maturity. He became the constant student and companion of the famous hadith scholar Zainuddin al-Iraqi. Al-Haythami married Zainuddin's daughter, and he taught him the science of hadith and the method of extracting hadiths from works that were not mentioned in the Sound Six. As a result, Al-Haythami became an expert on this subject and composed a number of works on Zawaid. Later, he collected all of his books on Zawaid in a single encyclopedic work named Majma' al-Zawaid wa Naba' al-Fawaid. In it, he dropped the sanads for the sake of brevity, which created a kind of defect in the work, and arranged the book according to the Jami' and Sunan patterns, explaining the grade of the hadith or mentioning the names of defective narrators. However, his grading was not always accepted to later scholars. The book was published in 10 volumes in Cairo in 1352 AH. The Jami' of As-Suyuti. Jalaluddin Abdurrahman ibn Kamal ad-Din as-Suyuti was born in 849 AH, and his father died when he was 6 years old. His list of 150 teachers contained the names of all the famous scholars of his time. As-Suyuti compiled over 600 works, which were mostly abridgments of the books of earlier scholars. Many scholars of his day disliked his style of writing and accused him of stealing the materials of the early scholars. Ranking of Hadith collections. The works of Hadith literature have been grouped by the traditionists into 4 classes according to their authority and importance. First, to the first category belong the works which are considered the most reliable. These are I. The Muwaṭṭa of Maalik, II. Sahih al-Bukhari, and III. Sahih Muslim. The latter 2 of these works include almost all the traditions contained in the Muwaṭṭa, and hence most major traditionists do not include it in the 6 canonical collections. These 3 books have been generally accepted as authentic since the lifetime of their authors. The Muwaṭṭa was declared by Imam al-Shafi'i to be the most authentic book after the Quran, while the Sahih of al-Bukhari was, as described earlier, received by 90,000 students from the author himself, and was accepted as reliable by all the important traditionists of the time, such as Abul Hasan ibn al-Qattan and others. The Sahih of Muslim, too, did not take long to receive the general approval of the traditionists. Second, to a second category belong the 4 Sunan works, which, together with the 2 Sahih, are known as Al-Kutub al-Sitta, the 6 books, or As-Sahih al-Sitta, the sound 6. The tendency to associate some of the Sunan works with the 2 Sahih appears to have begun sometime in the middle of the 4th century, when Sa'id ibn al-Sakan announced that the 2 Sahihs of al-Bukhari and Muslim and the 2 Sunans of Abu Dawud and An-Nasa'i were the foundations of Islam. After a period of time, the JAAMI of at-Tirmidhi was added to the above 4 books, and the 5 together were given the title of Al-Uṣool Al-Khamsa, the 5 foundations. It is not easy to determine when the JAAMI of at-Tirmidhi received the general recognition of the traditionists. Ibn Hazm, whose list of reliable hadith works is still extant, directed some criticism against the book because it contained traditions related by the questionable figures of Al-Maslub and Al-Kalbi. But it is probable that the general recognition of at-Tirmidhi's JAAMI preceded that of the work of Ibn Majah, which was added to the 5 books for the first time by Muhammad ibn Tahir, who died around the beginning of the 6th century, 505/1113. Nonetheless, it has been pointed out that throughout the 6th century, a place among the 5 was denied Ibn Majah by the traditionists. It was from the 7th century that the 6 books became generally recognized as the most reliable collections of hadith. The following principles appear to have guided the traditionists in their choice of these 6 works. I. The compilers had laid down certain clear principles for the selection and assessment of the hadith they chose. II. They mostly contained sound or fair traditions, and any weak material was usually indicated as such. III. The material they contained had been carefully assessed and checked by the leading authorities in different parts of the Islamic world, and furnished with extensive commentaries which clarified their virtues and demerits. IV. They had been used as a basis for the establishment of legal and theological positions. Third, to a third category belong such MUSNADS, MUSANNAFs, and other collections as had been compiled before or after the Sahihs of al-Bukhari and Muslim, contained reliable as well as unreliable material, and had not been thoroughly examined by the traditionists or used as source texts in books of law and doctrine. Works of this type include the MUSNADS of Abd ibn Humayd and at-Tayalisi, and the Musannaf work of Abdur Razzaq ibn Abi Shayba, and others. Fourth, a fourth category contains collections of hadiths made by compilers who in the later period collected traditions which were not found in the collections of the early anthologists. Much such material was spurious. The Musnad of al-Khawarizmi may be included in this class. According to some authorities, there exists a fifth category of hadith works, which contain such traditions as are declared by the Muslim doctors to be unreliable or definitely forged.